Welcome to the webinar on speculative social science fiction as an approach to imagine alternative futures of digitalization and datafication in education. Whoever wrote that, it's a really long title. I actually wrote that, but anyway, this is the first webinar that we're organizing this year. And really nice to see so many people attending. My name is Marko Teräs. I work at in the sociology department at the University of Tampere, Faculty of Social Sciences in Finland. And our second host will be Pekka Mertala from the University of Jyväskylä. Pekka can say a couple of words about himself soon. Just a couple of words about the network. And I actually wrote notes to myself, which is not me, but I'm actually going to read this from the paper, so I get it right this time. This is an informal network for researchers and practitioners interested in critical perspectives in education and technology. The aim for founding the network was to connect and network researchers and practitioners in Finland and abroad to share research and thoughts on edtech, digitalization, and datafication. We founded this in 2020, and we've been sort of casually sharing thoughts with each other, organizing webinars, discussion, reading groups, and just informal networking events. So really nice to see people interested in these topics. So at this point, I'll give the room to Pekka to just tell a couple of words about the webinar.
Okay, thank you, Marko. And as Marko told, my name is Pekka Mertala. I work as an assistant professor of multiliteracies and digital literacies at the University of Jyväskylä, Finland, in the Faculty of Education and Psychology. And today we will have two fabulous speakers and two fabulous presentations. And we will have the presentations in a row. So we will have roughly 1 hour for the presentations and then 1 hour for the discussion. And you can either post your comments or questions or your thoughts to chat, or you can reserve a chance to speak your mind out. So either way, I will collect and write down all the comments and questions, and we will go through them in order, but we will make sure that both Felicitas and Hanna will have enough time and enough space to answer the comments and questions. And if you have any kind of technical difficulties or any other issues we can help you with, please send us a message through chat or through email. And welcome to the webinar. That's all I have to say in this moment.
Thanks, Pekka. So I could introduce you, Felicitas, with just a couple of words. I totally plagiarized this from the internet. Because I forgot to ask your bio or anything like that, which is very normal to me. But anyway, so this is the plagiarized version of the subject called Felicitas Macgilchrist. I was actually thinking of writing fictive bios to you both, but I just didn't want to risk it. So Professor Felicitas Macgilchrist, she's the head of, if this is wrong information, you have to just change your websites then. But head of the media transformation department at the George Eckert Institute and professor of media research at the George August University of Goettingen Institute of Education. Her current research focuses on the discourses and practices around educational technology, including critical and speculative approaches to digital education. She's the deputy speaker of the Leibniz Science Campus Post-Digital Participation, Braunschweig, co-editor of the journal Learning, Media and Technology, on the editorial board of Critical Discourse Studies and Historical Encounters, and on the board of the DiscourseNet Research Association. No additional fictive dimensions added into this. Anyway, the floor is yours, Felicitas.
Thank you very much. Great. I should add some more fiction things myself, right? I've been adding a fictional thing. I broke my wrist, and I've been saying to everybody that I broke it while I was doing a 180-degree backflip on the skateboard on a half pipe. But for some reason, absolutely nobody believes me on that. Let me try and find my slides here so I can show. those. So I hope you can see the slides. And I hope everyone can hear fully. Thank you very much for the invitation. Thank you very much for the kind introduction as well. I would have been interested to hear the fictional added parts to what you would have thought. But I'm delighted to be here to speak today about the idea of speculative fiction, social science fiction, and also I'm also honoured to be involved in this project, which Marco and Hanna and others are involved in on the speculative social science fiction of digitalization in higher education, about which Hannah's going to speak later more. I want to start with a quote from Ursula K. Le Guin, one of my favorite science fiction authors or speculative fiction authors, who says, science fiction isn't about the future. So what is it about, and how can it help us in the social sciences, in the humanities, understand digitalization, datafication, platformization, automation, and all these other ongoing changes in education that are somehow related to technology? How can science fiction help us imagine alternative futures in that sense? This quote is from The Left Hand of Darkness, from the introduction that Ursula K. Le Guin wrote to the novel. And she says in there, science fiction isn't predictive, it's descriptive. And I've got a quote from her to introduce this. She says, it's lovely to be invited to participate in futurological congresses where systems science displays its grand apocalyptic graphs, to be asked to tell the newspapers what America will be like in 20, 25 years and all that, but it's a terrible mistake. I write science fiction, and science fiction isn't about the future. I don't know any more about the future than you do, she says, and very likely less. So she insists in this forward here that science fiction isn't extrapolative. It doesn't take a trend or a phenomena from today and predict what's going to happen in the future. Instead, she invites us to think about science fiction as a thought experiment. And thought experiments, in that sense, are precisely about describing today, about describing the present moment. And the sociologist Daniel Hirschman, he said something similar in a recent article on why sociology needs science fiction, where he says science fiction can help us to understand reality in much the same way as a well-constructed Weberian ideal type. So in this sense, speculative methods are also about writing against the instrumentalist kind of research in education that wants to improve education, that wants to find out what works. And I think in this context of Credit Ed, I don't need to say much about this kind of critical research, but I want to highlight two aspects which I think are particularly important and particularly relevant to speculative methods of speculative fiction, social fiction. The one is, I assume that education is always already political. I think everyone in this room probably shares that. So digital technologies encode and normalize ways of learning, ways of being, ways of deciding, ways of expecting, ways of living. And these are ideologically positioned and not neutral. So the research question is, what kind of ideologies, what kind of futures these technologies or practices imagine, which they present as normal and as desirable, this sort of thing. Pazzi, no, we shouldn't see the slides change yet. I'm coming to that. So the second thing is, I assume that complexity, uncertainty, and risk are constitutive of education. They're not problems to be fixed. Risk is often seen as a problem to be fixed, but here, Jen Ross has suggested that we focus on the not yetness of education. She writes about speculative fiction. She writes that one way of changing the focus of research on digital education away from what works is by engaging in diverse knowledge practices, inventive knowledge practices, creative knowledge practices, to explore the not yetness of education. And that's one thing I think is really important for speculative social science fiction. So the main thought I want to explore today, and that's why we haven't changed slide, is because this idea science fiction is about the future, social science fiction isn't about the future, is the main thought I want to explore today. They're about these sort of methods that we're talking about are about the present, but they open new ways of understanding the contemporary world and new ways of imagining otherwise, which is a core task of critical scholarship. So in the next 15, 20 minutes, I want to sketch, it's a very straightforward talk. I want to sketch 3 approaches to speculative fiction, social science fiction, that I see in education research at the moment. One is social science and fiction. So they're taking social science and they're doing something fictional with it. And it's not even vaguely science fiction. It's social science fiction in that sense of social science plus fiction. Then a set of research, which is social science plus science fiction, where we're talking based on social science and embedded in social scientific findings, adding a science fiction dimension or a speculative fiction dimension in that sense. And then a third set where the social science and science fiction come together also with art as a way of presenting or as a way of doing scholarship. I've only got a couple of examples of each kind. There's a lot more work out there. I've got a couple of examples so I can talk about them in a little bit more detail. And through these three, most of my focus is on the writing of academic texts, but at the end I've got a couple of comments very briefly on data generation of how we can generate data through this kind of methodology, and some speculations, my own speculations about the future of this kind of scholarship. So the first, social science plus fiction. I want to start with this one because I think it tends to be forgotten at the moment because there's so much focus on futurity at the moment. A lot of people are interested in futurity, futures, imagining futures, talking about futures, constructing, deconstructing futures. And if there's only one thing you read after this talk, then I recommend you read this Peter Clough book. It's from 2002. It's quite a while ago now, but the book really moved me, and there's not a lot of academic work which I can say has really moved me as when I'm reading it. Clough gives us fictional characters. He has a chapter about Klaus, a chapter about Molly, a chapter about Bev, a chapter about Rob. Bev, in the chapter about Bev, we see Bev as a teacher falling apart. Klaus is an 8 or 9-year-old boy, and he emerges from Clough's research on teachers' perspectives on learning difficulties. So in this chapter in the book, instead of giving us the distanced report on special educational needs, on disturbing behaviours, on the relationship between social structures, school structures, and student behaviour, which I believe he also wrote that called distanced academic report. But in this book, he weaves a story about Klaus, including Klaus's father, including himself, and including, I found, enormously emotional episodes. He writes about poverty, he writes about the lack of love or the lack of being able to show love. He writes about PTSD, about the hope that the son shows, which Clough can see is utterly in vain, about the way you can see, says Clough, how the boy's future is going to go after only being with the father, the son, and the boy for just 10 minutes. Ideally, actually, I would read like a page from this just now to show you what it does, but that goes beyond the time I have here, so I just recommend reading it. Later in the book, Peter Clough then reflects on each of the stories and says, what can we get from these sort of stories? And he shows how when he wrote the story, it's tied to his own experiences with his own father, his own experiences being a father. And he reflects on how difficult it is to write about people who, about disproportionately harrowing experiences if we want to create believable characters, because he says the pain and horror of the story are just go beyond what seems possible for many readers in one life. So in this, it's based on ethnographic research, it's based on interviews he did, it's based on empirical research, and he's turned it into fiction. There's nothing about science fiction in these. The social science is the part that's combined with fiction. The article by Chad Lackey talks specifically about how he teaches it. It's a wonderful little article. Talks about how he teaches it with his students and gets his students to reflect on racism, classism, and these sort of classic sociological themes through writing sociological short stories. Okay, so that's all from the first section. Now the second section, where social science research is combined with a kind of science fiction kind of aspect. And I've got two examples, one from my own work here. For Futures, Peter Fraze, he's one of the editors at Jacobin, and he sketches 4 futures: communism, rentism, socialism, and exterminism. And you can tell which of these is, for an editor of Jacobin, which is more positively connotated and which is more negatively connotated. But both of these, we leaned really on his book for an idea of what we wanted to do in the Learning Media and Technology article. Both of these books, articles, and this sort of section of the research has a much more straightforward writing style, where Peter Clough, really, he's writing fiction and emotionally moving fiction. Here, these two books are much more sort of academic style. It's fictional, but it's more an accustomed way of writing, the way that I think we're accustomed to writing in academic and social sciences, humanities. With our article, first of all, we wanted to write one history of the 2020s. We set ourselves in 2040 and wrote back writing a history of the 2020s. And then we thought, no, we need at least 2 histories. Let's have one utopian one and one dystopian one. And then we found, and this is what I think is a key aspect of speculative methods, speculative fiction, we found the utopia had dystopian elements in it, and the dystopia had utopian elements in it, and it isn't so simple. And precisely overcoming this sort of simplistic or totalizing thing, which sometimes scholarship tends to do, is one of the potentials I see in social science fiction. I'm going to talk about this a little bit in more detail, since it was our article. We wrote then 3 histories in the end, which all are a little bit utopian and a little bit dystopian. And sorry, one more thing. Basically, when we're writing these histories, we saw it as a kind of discourse analysis, not the kind of discourse analysis which is systematic and you've got a corpus and you trace out different codings and things like this, but what kind of power relations, forms of subjectivation, kind of norms and normalizations, the talk and the writing and the thinking about education and technology present as normal, as desirable. So a kind of discourse analysis where we teased out 3 different kinds of discourses which are in the world today and which open up different kinds of futures. And I want to say just briefly something about each of them. So the first one, smooth users, competent subjects. Here, basically this is the world of today in the main dominant sort of discourse that's used being taken forward into the 20s. So we wrote from 2040 looking backwards, the focus in the 20s lay on responding to the challenges of the digital world. Digitalization rolls in on us and we have to react. This is really key across a lot of policy papers that we've been looking at. And here we've got a sense of frictionless software, we've got AI, we've got everything becoming easier and more simple due to this technology. We put in little details like a former Google education data scientist was appointed the EU Commissioner of Education in 2029 to point out how this post-democratic move of public decisions about public education being made in outside of the public sphere in corporations, etc., became sort of very dominant in the decision making about education and technology. Here we also had this idea of an agreeable individual. There's no more conflict in this world. Everything's smooth and frictionless. There's no conflict. It's about creating novel ideas, solving problems, and everything works well and smooth. Obviously, there's also positive elements in here, but it's also a bit of a scary prospect, we thought. The second one, digital nomads, this is what my co-author Heidrun Allen, this is one of her key focuses, and she's written other things about this too. Digital nomads who extract themselves completely from the public sphere. They don't pay taxes anymore, they take their kids out of formal schooling, they don't use public universities, they use these alternative universities. In the 2020s, we said, solopreneurs profited from geo-arbitrage, earning income from hard currency markets, Germany, US, Finland, but incurring low living expenses by living on the beach in Indonesia, Vietnam, and Thailand. It's the living the dream idea. Freedom as this very, very, very big idea that is followed up. There's the conference on the DNX, Digital Nomads conference. It's very much about holistic lifestyles. There's a lot of data literacy necessary to be able to make profit from the platforms like Airbnb and Amazon and things like this. And then the third one, collective agents. Here, this is what we started off as the most utopian of our imaginations. By 2020, it had become clear that new solutions were required for capitalism, socioeconomic inequalities, ecological damage, surveillance, and corporate political dependencies. So here we're talking about convivial educational technology, which has been developed and designed, care being more important, responsibility for humans and non-human actors. There's degrowth becomes a logical, sensible option for many people. Open educational resources are an open access, open source becomes clear. Privacy by design is embedded, etc. And we had the Interinstitutional Agency for Livable Futures was founded in 2024. And we wrote this before I had read The Ministry of the Future, the science fiction book, which has a similar thing which changes how people live and the norms of the world. Okay, so what I wanted to say with those examples is just that it's far more, they're far more aligned with maybe, I don't want to say standard social science research, but more less unusual social science or humanities research. And the last section, the last set of examples I want to talk about is where art is embedded much more. It's social science fiction, social science based in interviews, in ethnographic observations, in actual data collection, but also science fiction in the sense of this futurity and time travel and things like this, but also presented in an artistic way as a work of art itself. And there's just one example I want to talk about here, although there are more, from Ewan Costello and colleagues. This is chapter 3 in a so far a three-piece work. Books Are Not Like People, a post-digital fable. And they say of themselves that the article uses speculative fiction as a form of narrative inquiry to explore the socio-materiality of the iconic educational artifact of the textbook. I'm quoting their abstract. The paper gives an empirical account of socio-material practices of textbook use and non-use gathered from a series of interviews with online distance education students. And they analyze these interviews via speculative fiction. So there's a much more concrete, I've seen this in more recent work, a much more concrete use of a specific set of interviews or a specific corpus which has been analyzed in the way it's then presented in a very different kind of way. So they've got a dystopian academy, the University V, who doesn't know anymore what books are in this sense and tries to work out what books are by traveling through time to different places. The key for this, I'm going to cut short this example just now given the time, but the key here is that speculative fiction isn't just the writing up here, but it's also a research method to analyze and interpret the empirical data that they work with. Okay, and I want to just say one thing about data generation, because it's from a project that we're working on just now. A lot of the speculative fiction and social science fiction that I'm seeing just now works with corpora of data and things to interpret them in a certain way. We, in this project, Ethic, Education, Technology and Inequality After Corona, a Critical Utopian Approach, we ask in the interviews, we ask our interview partners to speculate as one of the questions, to speculate on a utopian future. And we noticed there that people can't just make utopias just like this. None of the authors that we talk about thinks of a utopia straight away. It's a lot of hard work that goes into thinking up a utopia. And we drew on Frederick Jameson's literature studies here when he's saying, or he's noting that utopias actually always happen in an enclave. Because with an enclave, a planet or an island or something, you don't need to worry about how to get from here to there. And so in the interviews, we started to offer them an enclave. We said, imagine there's a new planet, imagine there's an island, imagine some sort of enclave. And then the responses were far more distant from today. They were more speculative in that sense. So that's just one small comment on that, which I'm happy to talk about later, or other examples like this. And then to conclude, I've got some speculations on the future of speculative fiction, social science fiction. I want to highlight 3 things in all brevity just now. The first thing is that it's a challenging genre. Most of us in social science or humanities are not trained in writing fiction. In a book project that we did a few years ago, we wrote fictive dialogues, and some are very artistic and some are less artistic. I think this is a very challenging thing in how this sort of thing can be written. And that's one thing that makes it challenging. The second thing is I want to return to Ursula Le Guin here with another short extract from the foreword from Left Hand of Darkness that I quoted at the beginning. She says, when we're done with reading a novel, we may find, if it's a good novel, that we're a bit different from what we were before we read it, and that we've been changed a little, as if by having met a new face, crossed the street we never crossed before, but it's very hard to say just what we learned and how we changed. And precisely this, because it's hard to say what we learned and how we changed, it's challenging to put it in an abstract or to talk about it in the 3 minutes that you have, or the tweet that we have to show the key finding from the article. Because the whole point is there isn't one simple key finding. The whole point is that there's the complexity, which isn't measurable in the 140 to 120 characters that we have. So maybe this is also a queering of social science research in this sense. It's not about inter-rater reliability, it's not about validity, it's not about evidence-based research, the sort of thing that's expected of education very often. So it can seem, I wrote this somewhere else in an article on storytelling, it can seem subversive when we're telling stories, which means again that peer reviewers often don't know what to do with this sort of piece of work. Peer reviewers for the kind of journals that one wants to publish in don't know what to do with this kind of work. And then you end up, Costello and colleagues, their article has a wonderful introduction which reflects on how a story doesn't usually have an introduction. And this sort of thing needs to be done. But precisely because of this, that's the enormous potential of opening new ways of thinking, but it's not easy. Disrupting totalizations, Maria Puig de la Casa reflects on this in her speculative ethics of care a lot more, in that exactly this sort of speculation and the openness and the complexity and the uncertainty and the risk and the ambiguity of fiction interrupts any sort of move that we might make to make too simple or too quick accounts of power or capitalism or other kind of debunking kind of research, which can seep into critical scholarship. And one final thing, a slow scholarship. There's a lot of pleas for slow scholarship all over the place. I think it can take longer to do unusual genres well in ways which make it through the hoops that academic scholarship has. I think the route that we took in the second section that I showed of writing more in academic style is easier, but I think the first and the third are at the moment, that's where there's most potential and they're most exciting because they do this artistic kind of writing as well. Slow scholarship is also sort of the opposite of the metrics and datafication that we find ourselves in. Nelly Piatoyeva and Antti Saari have written about this, also how we are part of datafication. Scholars are part of the datafication and embedded in the datafication that we critically analyze. So just a general plea here for slow scholarship as a utopian way and a speculative way of doing educational research today. And with this plea, I would come to a close, and there's some of the literature that I mentioned along the way, or that goes in this, only a few things that follow up in this direction. And then I thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Felicitas. Like I said in the beginning, for those who came late, we're taking the questions after the both presentations. So, but thank you so much for this. There's several things I would like to sort of start discussing already, but I'll just hold my tongue and actually give the floor to the second speaker, and I'll just introduce her with the non-fictional account also this time. Well, actually, who knows what is this fiction or reality as such, in a sense. But okay, the next speaker will be Dr. Hanna Teräs. So she's a principal lecturer in the School of Professional Teacher Education at Tampere University of Applied Sciences. She's worked 20 plus years with teaching and researching online learning, e-learning, and teacher education. She's the developer and former lead of the 21st Century Educators and International Online Teachers Education Program, and the member and co-founder of CARD, Critical Applied Research of Digitalization in Education Research Group, which I'm also involved with. 2018, if I get these right, 2018 and 2021, she led a Finnish Ministry of Education and Culture funded project on piloting and researching learning analytics in the universities of applied sciences in Finland with 11 higher education institutions. So her professional career has taken her around the world. For example, she's worked in various universities in Australia, Wollongong, Curtin University and Murdoch University, and through an EU project that aims to advance equity and access to higher education through open and distance learning. She's worked with several Southeast Asian universities in Malaysia, Indonesia, and the Philippines. So her current research focuses on critical edtech studies and using speculative and utopian methods to imagine alternative futures for digital education. Currently, she is also an invited pedagogical online learning expert in the Finnish Ministry of Education and Culture funded national project DigiVision 2030 and in a World Health Organization development project to develop WHO's online learning. Also, like a personal note, because like you see from the very long bio, I know her pretty well. She's one of the best co-authors and funding application writers I've ever worked with, but most of all, a great co-op player in Xbox shooter games such as Halo, Gears of War, and Borderlands, which most likely have kept her sane while working in higher education. So this is your time, Hanna. Go ahead.
Oh my gosh, that was long.
Sorry
Thank
about
you
that.
for the very detailed and elaborate introduction, which was almost longer than my presentation will be. But it's such a pleasure to be here with you, sharing about this really fascinating topic that I'm so excited about our research. I believe that just as Felicitas said, this is hard. It's not easy, but there is potential. There's potential for something different. There is potential for making a difference. And for me, research has always been about making a difference and not about lengthening my CV or my publications list, but about making a difference. And since I'm a teacher educator first and foremost, and an online pedagogical designer also, that's the angle that I'm approaching this topic from. And now I'm realizing that I don't yet have my presentation up. So let's just share it. Here we go. This has animation. It's cool. My topic today is why social science fiction? And of course, this is a big question, and there would be countless other answers to the question, depending on your research background, those topics that you're interested in, those the background that everyone brings to the table. But in my presentation, I share with you why I believe social science fiction is helpful in studying the digitalization of higher education, because that's where I come from. First of all, I believe that, life is about narratives. Everything can be seen as a narrative. Everything is a story. And digitalization of higher education most certainly is a story. It's a narrative in very many senses. There is someone who is telling the story. There are others who are hearing the story, who are receiving the story, who are responding to the story, but not everyone is writing the story. And this is like the starting point for what I'm going to talk about. In our earlier research, we have really come up with two interesting, different, and compelling narratives of digitalization of higher education. And I'm going to share those two stories with you in a moment. But while I'm talking about this, the questions to be kept in mind are: who in each case is telling the story? Whose story is it? And who defines how the story goes and how it's going to end? Now, the first narrative is what I think we could call the grand narrative, or the main narrative of digital education. And this is a narrative that is currently being told and shared in educational institutions all around the globe. And the pandemic that we are experiencing has accelerated this narrative. And some characteristics of this narrative are listed here. You may have encountered these claims or these plot points of this story before, and I know, having looked at the participants list in this webinar, I know I'm preaching to the converted here, but you've all heard this. these are the voices that we hear. Digital technologies are revolutionizing learning. Once again, like ever since Anno Domini X, they are revolutionizing learning. Marco said that I've been involved in digital education, in online learning for plus 20 years, and I've seen different trends, technologies, and stuff come and go. And they were all supposed to revolutionize learning. TV was supposed to revolutionize, you know this story. It's always, but this is why it's a story. There is this attempt to create a sense of urgency, a plot thickens, something exciting is happening. Yeah, a revolution is coming up. This digital technology, this artificial intelligence, this learning analytics, wow, they're revolutionizing learning. You see how this is a story? It has nothing to do with reality. Learning has not been revolutionized yet. Another plot point is, or a storyboard, is that education is broken. And somehow technology will and is able to fix it. There's something wrong with how we teach. There's something wrong with education, and technology as a messianic figure will come and save the day, like Bruce Willis saved the earth from this from apocalypse in so many movies. Yeah, I'm an 80s kid because I first think about Bruce Willis. Some of you might think about other people. Iron Man comes and saves the day. Yeah, you've all heard this. It's a story. It's not based on reality. Nobody is telling us how exactly education is broken. What does it mean? What does broken mean? What would it look like when it's not broken? And why is technology something that could fix it? These things are not really talked about very much in educational policy and practice in our universities, in our educational institutions. All we hear is that there is this technology that is revolutionizing everything and fixing everything. What we have found and is that this conversation, this story is being discussed, but a discussion is only allowed in a very limited, in a very narrow universe of discourse. The boundaries of how you are supposed to talk about a digitalization in education is clearly limited. There is a box that you are supposed to stay inside. And this narrative goes very much unquestioned in educational policy and practice. And to add to the sense of urgency, we keep hearing these messages, how digitalization is important. It's important because it's important. It's important in education because it's happening. and because it's happening, we need to react, and that's why it's important. You see how this is, it leads nowhere. It's important because it's important. And we don't really stop to tell a different story. But this is the story that characterizes decisions, curriculum development, investments in educational institutions. However, there is another story. This is not all there is to it. Why am I not able to change slides? Oh, yeah. I'm sure you don't know. The Finns will know what I mean with own cow in the ditch. This is a direct translation of a Finnish idiom into English, meaning a person who has their own cow in a ditch is a person with a conflict of interest in a certain matter. So they only want to save their own cow that has fallen into the ditch. They're not thinking about the big picture. They have an own cow that needs to be their own interest that needs to be looked after. And this is very much the case in why and how the narrative that I just shared with you has become so prominent is because it comes from the thoughts of those who actually benefit financially from it. so there's the future of education is very much influenced by different vision papers, different programs that assume this type of a future, and it requires certain changes. We need to adapt to this change, and all these recommendations and conclusions tend to be based on not research knowledge, but on vision papers, on blogs, on consulting companies' opinions, on Silicon Valley edtech companies' message. So they definitely do have their own cow in the ditch. That's what I wanted to say with this slide. And in this narrative, I'm talking about university teachers. I could say teaching academics, I could say academics, I could say teachers. I'm talking about university teachers because that's what we talk about in my institution. Research on teachers and digitalization tend to focus on either they're investigating teachers' digital skills or the lack of those, teachers' attitudes towards technology or the technology acceptance. This is the majority of a research focuses on this. And in all this, teachers are mainly seen as a target group for professional development activities, rather than active players in the story, rather than people who actually build and tell the story. They are characters in the story to whom these events happen. Therefore, it's critical to hear the other story as well. This is a story from another earlier research study that we've made. We did narrative interviews with experienced university teachers to hear, by experienced, I mean people with 20+ years of experience in the field, and who would be able to reflect on how things have changed, and how universities have changed, and how their experience of being a teacher, of being an academic, has changed. And this was a narrative study. We did narrative interviews, and when I was analyzing the interview data, I've used, when I've done narrative studies, I've used the classical play, a 3-act structure to retell the story, and I wanted to do it here. But very soon I realized that it was impossible, because the classical 3-act play it ends in a resolution. But these stories did not have a resolution. These stories did not end well. They were not happy stories. They had a very happy beginning, but at the moment they were not happy. And I soon realized that it actually follows the structure of a classical tragedy. There was the introduction when the person had entered the field. They had a lot of expectation. They were enthusiastic, excited about their career. That's the rising movement. And what? Something happened and turned it into a falling movement, ending in a catastrophe, which is the ending of a tragedy. And in these cases, this catastrophe meant loss of agency, certain kind of hopelessness about the future, cynicism, and not being able to see much light at the end of the tunnel. And this was really, really sad. Like, why are these stories so sad? Like, how can we, what can we do about this? And this was the moment of realization that we have to think of something that will be able not just to describe and tell the story of what is, but tell the story of what could be. To change the ending, to not be content with the catastrophe, but find ways of moving forward from that wall that we sort of hit with this research, of the wall of no resolution. And that's how we came up with the idea of social science fiction. So in social science fiction, I see teachers as authors of the story, of their own futures. And I believe that speculative social science fiction actually provides a methodology that can challenge the main narrative. It can challenge the stories that have earlier been told. It can create cracks in a fixed reality and help imagine different realities. And it's very much based on the idea of emancipation and participation. Remember how I just said that in earlier research and in this digitalization narrative, teachers and academics have largely been objectified as people to whom these things happen. Digitalization happens to them. They are characters in this story, but we want to create an opportunity for them to be the writers of the story in imagining alternative futures and creating alternative futures as well. So this is very briefly, and I've gotten so carried away, I don't know if I'm doing okay with time or not. I don't have much left, so bear with me. We have only just started a new research project called Speculative Social Science Fiction of Digitalization in Higher Education towards a humanized digital future. This is a research project that has gotten funding from the Academy of Finland, and we've started in September. And this is the structure of what we are attempting to do in this research project. So it's very much about narratives. We explore the main narrative, answering the research question: how is digitalization discursively and pragmatically constructed in the context of higher education? How is this story constructed? Where does it come from? This is followed with a counter narrative. Counter narrative is the slides that I showed at the beginning there are sort of like the main narrative and a counter narrative in like a glimpse of those, like a teaser. So the counter narrative is what is the lived experience of the people involved in this story? What is their side of the story? What is it like? This moves on to creating alternative narratives. How do higher education teachers or teaching academics envision either desirable or undesirable digital futures or futures of higher education? And as a result, we come up with a portrait of a humanized digital future, what it could be. What would the characteristics of a humanized digital future be? So it's a very narrative research project, but as I just explained, we believe that the aspect of speculative social science fiction is key in bringing us to the end of the story, not remaining in the main narrative and counter narrative, but actually coming up with a humanized digital future, which is what the research project is aiming at. And for those interested in the methodological framework, in how exactly we are planning to do all this, this little diagram here attempts to describe that. So the methodological framework is institutional ethnography, in social science fiction, which in practice will be conducted through document analysis, narrative interviews, method of empathy-based stories, that's what the MEBS stands for, method of empathy-based stories, and future workshops with teachers in higher education. We've already started with document analysis, and we've started with the first round of the empathy-based stories with students in professional teacher education. So we've gotten started, but it's just the first steps. There is a lot more to come during this project. And we are reporting all of this in the form of narratives. It's the main narrative, counter narrative, alternative narrative, and in the end, a humanized digital future. If this is something that interests you and you would like to stay in touch and stay on track and what's happening, here are a few links. There is a link to our research group website, CARD website, and the research project is described there in more detail. There's my ResearchGate profile and links to 2 of our journal articles from recent months and years, through which you can get a fuller picture of what we are doing and planning to do. It's 5 to 1, so I feel like I'm probably doing okay on time.
You're perfect.
And that's all I want to say about it. Thanks very much for your interest. Marco, one question, and Pekka, will you be sharing these slides with people so that the links will actually make sense?
Well, we can put them on the blog if you want.
Because I just can't think that it's no use sharing links to people if they can't click on them.
Or I can do them individually on the YouTube video.
Fantastic.
Yeah, well, we'll see. We'll
Okay.
share them.
So I'll stop sharing now, and
thank you.
And you can move us forward.
Lovely. Thanks, Hanna, for the presentation, and thanks to both of you. This is usually the point where I give the floor to Pekka. Pekka is good in facilitating the question and answers section, because I most likely would grab it with my long list of questions that I already have here. So go ahead.
Thank you. And this is also the time when we turn off the recording. So in case you have questions and comments, we won't be recording them. So